Hi folks, I'm Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria in Easton Antique Arms, and I'm here today to talk about a very serious issue concerning the cult of the Spadroon and the harm it's doing to the sword community. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now, I've noticed in recent days or weeks, but actually this goes back years, and there is a growing cult of the Spadroon. Now, I understand that the Spadroon, what is a Spadroon for a second? Well, that is one of the topics of this video, but here is a fairly typical Spadroon of the, let's say, American Wars of Independence and Napoleonic Wars era. Okay, so we're talking about the late 1700s into the early 1800s. Now, most people agree on what certain Spadroons are. Most people would agree that this is a Spadroon. But the problem is that the Spadroon has gained quite a lot of, quite a big fan base. It's quite a small fan base, but quite a vocal and enthusiastic fan base. Now, I'm not attacking them at all, and obviously I'm joking when I say that there's a cult of the Spadroon. Or am I? One of the things I've noticed in the last few months, but even today, and actually what's inspired me to make this video, is that there's some people wanting to, I suppose, define in too strict terms what a Spadroon is. Now, I understand why people want to do that, because people, certainly in the modern world, like typologies, they like to have very fixed terminologies. You know, if you look at something like the oak shot typology of medieval swords, you actually see people genuinely, like dozens of times in my life, I've seen people having really heated debates, arguments, flame wars, whatever you want to call them, on the internet about whether a sword is a Type 18 or a Type 15, for example. It could be between a Type 12 and a Type 13 or whatever. There are certain types which just kind of cross over. Now, to those people, just reality check here, okay? That oak shot typology was created by one man, and it was his attempt to try and take all of the medieval swords that have ever been made and put them into a typology so that people could refer easily. It was to aid communication, not to obstruct it. They could refer easily to a particular type of sword. So generally speaking, if someone says to me, oh yeah, it's Type 15 longsword of the early 15th century, I know pretty much what they're talking about. I know that it's got a tapering blade, it's got a pointy shape, probably flattened diamond section, and it's a longsword. So within a few words you can be quite precise. Now, this is transferred over to later period swords, and obviously for later period swords we have patterns or models, usually known as patterns in British circles, usually known as models in continental European circles. So for example, you know, we might refer to the 1803 pattern, so-called flank officers, let's call it an infantry officer's saber, which is those two there, okay? Or we might refer to a 1796 light cavalry saber, in this case an officer's version, which is that one there. There are some swords, however, which don't fit into this. For example, the one above it is inspired by a 1796 light cavalry officer's sword, but there are some differences to it. You'll notice it's more curved, it's got a more slanted back strap or back piece, as it's called, so it's got a slightly different, but it is basically inspired by the pattern. But then you get other things that we don't really know what to call them, like the sword above the 1803 there, the one at the top up here, is what would commonly be called in antique circles a flank officer's saber, because it's a type of saber that we know was being carried by flank officers unofficially when they weren't necessarily supposed to be carrying that. They should have been carrying a Spadroon, and we'll come back to Spadroons in a second. But this was the type of sword that they started carrying, but it doesn't have a pattern because it wasn't an official model. So how do we refer to it? Well, clearly it's inspired by the 1796 light cavalry saber. So we would refer to it as a 1796 inspired infantry officer's saber. I think that's the most accurate description for it. Now, back to Spadroons. So the statement I saw today, in very fervent terms, I don't know whether it was intended that way, but that's how it read, was someone had made a replica Small sword. Now, what's a small sword for a second? Well, I'll grab something I think everyone would agree is a small sword. So this is a Colishmard small sword of a type of, a lot of people would think of this as a dueling sword, but they were carried by military officers as well, army and navy. And the Colishmard means it's got a wide section at the base of the blade, which has various purposes I've talked about in previous videos, so you can search for small sword in my back catalogue. But essentially most people think that this is for parrying larger weapons, sabres and broadswords and stuff. However, I think it has some other purposes as well. But anyway, this is a Colishmard small sword that was sometimes used by the military, was usually carried by gentlemen, and indeed was used for duelling as well, when a pistol wasn't used. Now, the small sword in question wasn't quite like this. It had a slightly broader blade and it had edges on it. Okay, now this is a triangular section blade. For those of you who don't know, if you've ever done épée fencing, an épée blade is based on a small sword blade. In fact, in France, this would be called an épée. Okay, so the épée, which just means sword in French, actually refers to a small sword, and we'll come back to terminology in a minute. So this is a triangular blade, but some small swords don't have triangular blades. They have lozenge section blades, or they have flattened diamond section blades. You can get various different cross sections to a small sword. And there is a problem here in people's understanding of what the small sword is. And the small sword isn't just one thing. It's not just a triangular bladed sword that can't cut because it's got a triangular blade. There are types of small sword which can cut, and this is mentioned in period treatises, and there are a very few small sword treatises which have cutting actions in them. And without a shadow of a doubt, there are antique small swords which are unquestionably small swords that have some degree of cutting capacity. They're not going to be cutting off people's arms or even fingers, but they have a slashing or slight cutting capacity to them. Now, the statement that was made was that if something looks like a small sword but can cut, then it's a spadroon. No, categorically wrong, I would say. Although, if you want to call it a spadroon, then that's your business. But you can't tell someone else that what they have, which is basically a small sword to most people in the world, is not a small sword because it's a spadroon. Okay? The simple fact is that terminology is a fluctuating thing. And terminology isn't used by the same people in the same way. Sorry, isn't used by different people in the same way, and isn't used within a given period even by different people in the same way. So, this indeed is a small sword, and I think pretty much everyone would call this a small sword. But, for example, what's this? Okay, well, you might be wondering, what is that, Matt? Well, this is what's essentially a small sword blade, or an épée blade. It's a triangular blade on what would usually be referred to as a saber hilt. In fact, this is a pattern. This is a military pattern. This belonged to a lieutenant colonel of the Scots Guards. So this is the 1854 pattern Foot Guards saber hilt, but normally it has a saber blade on it. But he wanted a long, thin, what at the time was actually known as a rapier blade. And there's another example. So we actually find in the 18th and 19th century these small swords, which we all agree are small swords, yeah, these were sometimes referred to as rapiers. But hold on, Matt, isn't a rapier, I actually don't have one in here, but isn't a rapier a much longer, earlier period sword with a swept hilt or a basket hilt, and it's a cut and thrust sword? Yeah, that is a rapier, but rapier is also a word. And the fact is that people use words in different ways. And the simple fact was that in the 18th century, if we look at Zachary Wilde's treatise from 1711, he refers to small swords as rapiers. And that is because to their thinking, a broadsword is a sword that is predominantly a cutting sword, and a rapier is a sword that's predominantly a thrusting sword, and a small sword is predominantly a thrusting sword, even though some of them have some slight cutting capacity to them. Now back to spadroon. So the next thing to say is, while the word spadroon has its origins outside of England, the word spadroon, as we spell it, is really an English word, and the word spadroon was used in English sources to refer to swords like this, and these are both Napoleonic era, or perhaps even slightly earlier than Napoleonic era, infantry officers' swords, or spadroons. Now in period sources, they weren't normally called spadroons, they were normally called Swords, that's right, swords. So the most commonly used word for all of these swords is sword. And if we look at other languages, in Italian it would be spada, in French it would be épée. So yeah, you do have words like spadino in Italian for small sword, and which is used sometimes. But usually, if you look in the fencing treatises or any other kind of military texts, they refer to these as swords. They are swords. They don't use the word spadroon. Even in English texts, the word spadroon is not used very much. So it's particularly silly, some might even say idiotic or foolhardy, to try and stick the word spadroon on things which are may or may not be a spadroon according to your interpretation, but which in period would not have been called spadroons. They would have just been called sword, or indeed small sword. So that, standard, if we're in France, for example, this would be called an épée, but for a fact there is the épée de soldat in France, which in England, certainly now most people would refer to, they go, oh, well, that's a spadroon. But the French called it an épée de soldat, and they called a small sword an épée. So épée just means sword. So now we get on to a couple of other interesting examples from my collection. Here is a French infantry officer's sword. You might at first sight think that it's an 1882. It's actually not, probably dates before that. It's probably for one of the African-based regiments, North African. So it's a pre-1882, probably dates to about 1860s, I would guess. And it's a double-edged thrusting blade with some cutting capacity. Yes, you can cut slash with this, you could hack with it with not a huge amount of force, but nevertheless it has some cutting capacity. It's a bit like a scaled down version of a rapier blade. So what do we call this? Well, what did the French call it? They called it a saber. That's right, the French call it a saber. So this is where we come back to sabers and the problematic nature of the fact that, yes, in England usually a saber means a curved object, hence a saber-toothed tiger. Saber-toothed tigers, saber-toothed cats don't have straight teeth. They're specifically called that because everybody recognised in the English language, certainly, well, in Britain, maybe not in America, but in Britain they recognised that saber implied a curved blade. That being said, saber was sometimes applied to straight blades as well, which gets even more confusing. If we go to Italy, sciabola originally meant a curved blade, but by the end of the 19th century it was referring to a straight blade. In France, saber probably comes from the German sabel, which in turn probably comes from the Hungarian and Polish szabla. Szabla did originally mean a curved sword. Sable in Germany pretty much always meant a curved sword. They usually referred to a straight sword like a spadroon as a degen, or a palash if it was a broader blade. But so sable and szabla mean a curved blade. When the French adopted the word saber, it mostly meant a curved blade, but could sometimes mean a straight blade. So confusing. The French would call this a saber. Modern HEMA people might call it a spadroon. In the 19th century, a British person might refer to this as a rapier, just to confuse matters even further. So do you see how ridiculous it is to get really pedantic about the words? Because the fact is that even within the same period, if we go to the year 1890, different people in different countries would refer to this as sword, saber, rapier, épée, spada, all of the other, you'd have a whole bunch of different terms to refer to this. Finally, and this is an even more confusing example, and I don't know what to call it. Here we have what is, it's a British sword, probably heavy, Napoleonic heavy cavalry officer's dress sword. But it has a triangular section blade. I have shown this quite a long time ago, but it has a triangular section blade where the rib of the triangle is towards the back of the blade, which leaves a long, thin cutting edge. And 100% this has been made where they went, okay, I want a triangular blade, but I want it to be able to cut. And so the sword maker has gone, triangular blades don't really cut. How can I make this work? And this is what they've done with this sword. So this is a shearing or cutting sword, and that's another term, incidentally, shearing sword, that comes up in English sources in the 18th century. The word spadroon is not even used very much. Usually things are either referred to as swords or they're referred to as shearing swords, sometimes as rapiers. The word spadroon isn't actually very widespread in the period when spadroons, as we recognise them, actually come from. So what would we refer to this as? Well, I am certain that the modern spadroon cultists sorry to use a derogatory term, but I can't think how else to explain it, would go, well, this can cut, so it's a spadroon. It's got a hilt like a small sword, but it's got a shearing blade, so I definitely call that a spadroon. But in period, this almost certainly would not have been called a spadroon. It just would have been called a sword. And the people would have recognised, they would have looked at it and gone, oh, it's got some qualities of a small sword combined with maybe a rapier, combined with a shearing sword, combined with a spadroon, combined with all of the other words they use for these weapons. So what do we call this now? Would I call this a spadroon? I wouldn't be bothered by calling it a spadroon. Would I call it a small sword? I wouldn't be bothered if I called it a small sword. I might in one video refer to this as a small sword, and I might in another video refer to it as a spadroon. I might refer to it as a shearing sword. I might just refer to it as a sword. So there we go, folks. I hope that gives a fairly comprehensive and rounded view of this subject. Don't be too pedantic about terminology. You can decide what you want to call things, but don't enforce your personal rules on everyone else, because very often they won't be applicable and they don't have historical basis. The fact is that a sword like this in the year 1800 or 1790, this wouldn't necessarily be called a spadroon, it wouldn't necessarily be called a small sword, wouldn't necessarily... the only thing we can say without doubt is that they would call it a sword. Any other more specific terms are down to your personal taste and interpretation, and even in period 200 years ago that would have been true as well. One person might have called it one thing, another person might have called it another. Thanks for watching. If you haven't done already, please consider subscribing. I've got extra videos on Patreon. Remember to give us a like, share this video if you liked it as well, and I'll see you soon on the channel for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.